November 18, 1943, Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Lieutenant Commander Akiko Yamashita stood frozen at her post in the communications center of the Combined Fleet headquarters, her hands trembling as she decoded the message that had just arrived. In the past 96 hours, 7 heavy cruisers had simply disappeared from their convoy routes, not to carrier strikes she could track on radar, not to surface engagements that left survivors to report, but to something hunting invisibly beneath the Pacific's dark waters. The warships were vanishing without warning, without distress calls, without any chance to fight back. The night air hung heavy with humidity as Yamashita stared through the observation windows overlooking Truk's supposedly impregnable anchorage. She had spent the last 3 years meticulously tracking fleet movements, analyzing loss patterns, coordinating convoy schedules. But nothing in her training at the Imperial Naval Academy had prepared her for what the numbers were now revealing. Something had changed in the American submarine force. Something fundamental and terrifying. What Lieutenant Commander Yamashita didn't know, what the entire Japanese Naval General Staff wouldn't comprehend until it was far too late, was that this moment marked the beginning of the most devastating naval campaign in maritime history. The Americans hadn't just improved their submarines, they had transformed them into perfect killing machines, equipped with weapons that finally worked, tactics that exploited every Japanese weakness, and commanders who had learned to hunt with ruthless efficiency. The crisis that would claim 334 Japanese warships had been building since early 1943, though its origins stretched back to the war's first desperate months. In those early days, American submarines had been nearly useless, plagued by torpedoes that ran too deep, exploded prematurely, or simply failed to detonate at all. Japanese naval officers had grown contemptuous of American submariners, viewing them as ineffective nuisances rather than serious threats. But by November 1943, everything had changed. The Mark 14 torpedo, after 2 years of denial and bureaucratic resistance, had finally been fixed. The depth control mechanism was corrected, the magnetic exploder was deactivated, the contact exploder was redesigned, and suddenly American submarines were sinking everything they could find. Among those who first recognized the new reality was Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, commander of the destroyer Asakaze, which had survived more convoy escort missions than any other vessel in the fleet. His reports to Combined Fleet headquarters, filed throughout October and November 1943, painted an increasingly desperate picture. The American submarines no longer miss. They fire spreads of 4 to 6 torpedoes from multiple angles. Our evasive maneuvers, which once saved us, now merely delay the inevitable. They are hunting us with a precision that suggests they know our routes, our speeds, our schedules before we do. Captain Tanaka was right. The Americans did know. Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis team at Pearl Harbor had broken the Japanese naval codes as early as 1942, but it took another year for the submarine force to learn how to exploit this intelligence effectively. By late 1943, American submarine commanders were receiving detailed information about convoy routes, departure times, cargo manifests, and escort compositions before Japanese ships even left port. The first devastating demonstration came on November 19, 1943, in the waters east of Formosa. The heavy cruiser Kumano, escorting a convoy of troop transports bound for Rabaul, never detected the submarine that killed her. USS Seahorse, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Slade Cutter, had been waiting at the convoy's intersection point for 6 hours, submerged at periscope depth, her crew silent as ghosts. According to Cutter's patrol report, later declassified by the U.S. Navy, the attack was textbook perfect. At 0342 hours, with Kumano silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, Seahorse fired a spread of 6 Mark 14 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 4 struck home. The cruiser's magazine detonated with such violence that the explosion was heard on Formosa, 60 miles away. Of Kumano's crew of 874 sailors, only 127 survived. The troop transports, now undefended, scattered in panic. 2 more fell to Seahorse's remaining torpedoes before dawn. What made this attack particularly devastating wasn't just the loss of the cruiser, but what it represented. Kumano was one of Japan's most modern heavy cruisers, commissioned in 1937, armed with 10 8-inch guns and protected by 4 inches of steel armor. It had survived the Battle of Midway, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and countless air attacks. None of it mattered against torpedoes that struck below the waterline, where no armor protected her vital machinery spaces. Lieutenant Commander Yamashita received the loss report at 0800 hours on November 20th. As she plotted Kumano's last known position on the operations map, she noticed something that sent ice through her veins. In the past 30 days, Japanese warships had been sunk at 17 different locations across the Pacific, not random attacks of opportunity, but coordinated strikes at critical choke points: the Luzon Strait, the Bungo Sweeto, the approaches to Truk, the convoy routes to the Philippines. She pulled the intelligence files on American submarine deployments. What she found defied belief. The U.S. Navy had only 150 submarines in the Pacific theater, yet they seemed to be everywhere at once. How were they achieving such comprehensive coverage? The answer, which she couldn't know, lay in a combination of ultra-intelligence, aggressive patrol tactics, and a new operational doctrine called Wolfpack tactics, borrowed from the Germans but adapted for the vast Pacific distances. The Japanese Navy's anti-submarine capabilities, impressive on paper, proved catastrophically inadequate in practice. Japan possessed 437 escort vessels at the start of 1943, including destroyers, destroyer escorts, and coastal defense ships. The fleet operated 89 purpose-built submarine chasers equipped with depth charges and sonar. Naval aviation contributed 342 patrol aircraft dedicated to anti-submarine warfare. Yet none of it worked effectively. The Japanese sonar systems, developed in the 1930s, couldn't detect submarines below 150 feet. American fleet submarines routinely operated at 300 feet or deeper when evading. Japanese depth charges were set to detonate at fixed depths, typically 50 to 150 feet. American submarines, upon hearing the characteristic ping of sonar, would dive to 400 feet and wait for the barrage to pass harmlessly overhead. Captain Kenji Watanabe, commander of Japan's anti-submarine warfare school in Sasebo, recognized these deficiencies as early as 1942. His memorandum to the Naval General Staff, discovered in post-war archives, outlined the problems with devastating clarity. Our doctrine assumes submarines will behave predictably, surfacing to attack and remaining at shallow depths. The Americans do neither. They attack from periscope depth and dive to depths our weapons cannot reach. We are fighting yesterday's submarines with yesterday's weapons. His warnings were ignored. Resources went to building battleships and carriers, not unsexy escort vessels and anti-submarine systems. By the time the crisis became undeniable, it was too late to correct course. The 2 months following Kumano's loss provided a preview of Japan's maritime catastrophe. On December 3, 1943, the destroyer Yugiri, veteran of the Java Sea campaign, struck by 3 torpedoes from USS Pogi northeast of Palau. She went down in 8 minutes, taking 241 sailors with her. December 11th, the light cruiser Agano, barely 6 months old, torpedoed by USS Skate in the waters off Truk, 533 dead. December 19th, the destroyer Numakaze, survivor of every major Pacific battle, finally caught by USS Greyback in the Luzon Strait. No survivors. What terrified Japanese naval planners wasn't just the losses themselves, but their locations. American submarines were operating with impunity in waters Japan had considered safe. Truk Lagoon, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was supposed to be impregnable, protected by minefields, submarine nets, and constant air patrols. Yet submarines were sinking ships within sight of the anchorage. The destroyer captain Hiroshi Tanaka, whose earlier warnings had gone unheeded, found himself vindicated in the worst possible way. On January 7, 1944, while escorting the battleship Yamato from Truk to Kure, his vessel Asakaze detected a submarine contact. He executed the standard attack pattern, dropping 18 depth charges in a rectangular pattern. The submarine, USS Harder, commanded by Samuel Dealey, waited at 350 feet until the attack ended, then surfaced behind the convoy and sank 2 of the 3 tankers Asakaze was supposed to protect. Tanaka's after-action report, written in barely controlled fury, laid bare the futility of Japanese anti-submarine warfare. "We detected the enemy. We attacked with full depth charge barrage. We drove him off according to doctrine, and he still killed 2 ships under my protection. Our weapons are useless. Our tactics are obsolete. The Americans are hunting us, and we have no defense." The psychological impact on Japanese naval crews became severe by early 1944. Sailors who had eagerly volunteered for service in the early war years now faced every departure with dread. The ocean, once Japan's highway to empire, had become a killing field where death came without warning from invisible enemies. According to testimony collected by American naval intelligence after the war, Japanese destroyer captains began refusing to leave port without air cover. Convoy commanders demanded unrealistic levels of escort protection. Some transport captains simply abandoned their vessels rather than face another voyage. The Imperial Navy was beginning to crack, not from lack of courage, but from the mathematical certainty that submarines would eventually find and kill them. By February 1944, Lieutenant Commander Yamashita's careful records revealed a pattern so devastating she initially thought she had made an error in her calculations. In the 3 months since Kumano's sinking, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 41 warships to submarine attack, not merchantmen carrying cargo, but actual warships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, auxiliary vessels, an average of 1 warship every 2.2 days. She prepared a detailed report for Admiral Koga Mineichi, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, documenting the losses and attempting to project future casualties if current trends continued. Her mathematics were simple and horrifying. At this rate, by the end of 1945, the Imperial Navy would lose approximately 370 warships to submarine attack alone. Admiral Koga read her report on February 28, 1944. According to his Chief of Staff's diary, discovered after the war, the Admiral's response was brief and chilling. "Your analysis is mathematically sound, but strategically impossible. The Americans cannot maintain this pace. They must run out of submarines, or torpedoes, or luck. Therefore, your projections must be wrong."
Lieutenant Commander Yamashita didn't argue. She simply returned to her post and continued recording the losses. She would watch her projections come true with terrifying accuracy. The Americans wouldn't run out of submarines, or torpedoes, or luck. They would run out of targets. What neither Yamashita nor Admiral Koga understood was the industrial and technological revolution that had transformed the American submarine force. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had delivered 76 new fleet submarines. Each one was more advanced than the last, incorporating lessons learned from combat reports that were read analyzed, and acted upon within weeks. The torpedoes that had failed so catastrophically in 1941-42 now worked with devastating reliability. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, which left no wake, was entering service. Newer boats carried 24 torpedoes instead of 16, allowing longer patrols and more attacks. More importantly, the American submarine force had developed an aggressive, coordinated doctrine that treated the entire Pacific as a hunting ground. Submarines weren't assigned random patrol areas and told to sink targets of opportunity. They were positioned at specific choke points based on ultra-intelligence, coordinated with each other to cover all approaches, and commanded by captains who had been given explicit orders: find Japanese warships and sink them. The Japanese response to this systematic destruction proved tragically inadequate. In March 1944, the Naval General Staff implemented new convoy procedures, requiring all warships to travel in groups of 3 or more, with mandatory zigzag patterns and depth charge barriers. These measures increased fuel consumption by 40% and slowed fleet movements by 30%, but did nothing to reduce losses. American submarines simply adapted. Coordinated wolf-pack attacks, where 2 or 3 submarines worked together, overwhelmed the defenses. One submarine would draw the escorts away with a false contact, while the others attacked the now undefended targets. Or submarines would trail convoys for days, radioing positions to other boats, allowing multiple submarines to converge for simultaneous attacks from different directions. The technology gap was widening, not closing. By mid-1944, American submarines were receiving SJ surface search radar that could detect ships at 15 miles in total darkness. Japanese warships had no comparable equipment. American boats carried FM sonar that could hear propeller noise at ranges Japanese sonar couldn't match. Some submarines were being equipped with experimental snorkel systems, allowing them to run diesel engines while submerged. But what really made American submarines unstoppable wasn't technology alone. It was the combination of working weapons, accurate intelligence, aggressive tactics, capable commanders, and, critically, enough submarines to exploit all these advantages simultaneously. Japan faced not occasional submarine threats, but a coordinated campaign of maritime strangulation executed by an enemy who was learning faster, adapting quicker, and building more submarines than Japan could sink. As March 1944 drew to a close, Lieutenant Commander Yamashita updated her casualty projections. The losses were accelerating, not stabilizing. In 3 months, 41 warships destroyed. At current rates, by year's end, perhaps 120 warships lost. And if the Americans continued improving their tactics, if their submarine numbers continued growing, she didn't finish the thought. The mathematics were too terrible. But deep down, she knew what was coming. The Imperial Japanese Navy was being systematically destroyed by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't catch, and couldn't stop. The silent hunters beneath the waves were winning a war that Japan's admirals still didn't fully understand they were losing. And this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. April 1944 marked the point when Japanese naval losses transitioned from crisis to catastrophe. Lieutenant Commander Akiko Yamashita's projections, dismissed by Admiral Koga as strategically impossible, were proving horrifyingly accurate. The submarines weren't slowing down, they were accelerating. The cascading effects rippled through every aspect of Japan's naval operations. Fleet movements that once took days now required weeks as ships took circuitous routes through supposedly safer waters. Training exercises were canceled entirely. New warships, freshly commissioned from Japanese shipyards, sat idle in port because their captains refused to risk the gauntlet of American submarines waiting in the shipping lanes. On April 26, 1944, the light cruiser Tatsuda was sunk by USS Sandlance off the coast of Honshu, barely 200 miles from Tokyo itself. The psychological impact was devastating. If submarines could hunt successfully that close to the Japanese capital, nowhere was safe. Captain Yuki Nakamura, who witnessed the attack from his destroyer, later told interrogators, We thought Tatsuda was invulnerable so close to home. When she exploded and sank in 4 minutes, every officer on my bridge understood that the ocean belonged to the Americans now, not to us. The human stories behind the statistics revealed a navy being systematically destroyed. On May 13, 1944, the destroyer Inazuma, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Sato, was torpedoed by USS Bonefish in the Sulu Sea. Sato had survived Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Guadalcanal. His ship had been hit by bombs, shells, and near-miss torpedoes throughout 3 years of war. None of it saved him from 3 Mark 14 torpedoes that struck his engine room at dawn. Of his crew of 228, only 41 survived. Sato was not among them.
His widow, Keiko Sato, received the standard notification: lost at sea in defense of the Empire. But sailors returning from the convoy told her the truth. Her husband's destroyer had been traveling in a protected formation, with air cover overhead and 2 other destroyers providing escort. The submarine had fired from 2,000 yards, struck 3 times, and disappeared without the escorts ever detecting it. The helplessness, the inability to fight back against an invisible enemy, haunted the survivors more than the loss itself. By June 1944, the numbers had become staggering. The Imperial Japanese Navy was losing an average of 2.3 warships every week to submarine attack. These weren't aging destroyers or obsolete cruisers. These were frontline combat vessels: the heavy cruiser Maya, the light cruiser Oi, the destroyers Tanikaze, Matsukaze, and Hayashimo. Each loss represented not just a ship, but hundreds of irreplaceable trained sailors and officers. The statistics revealed a one-sided slaughter. According to captured Japanese naval records, between January and June 1944, American submarines sank 87 Japanese warships while losing only 8 submarines to all causes. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. For every submarine lost, the Americans were destroying nearly 11 Japanese warships. No navy in history could sustain such losses. The Japanese submarine force, once feared throughout the Pacific, had virtually ceased to exist. American anti-submarine warfare, combined with the same ultra-intelligence that guided American submarine operations, had hunted Japanese submarines to near extinction. By mid-1944, Japan had fewer operational submarines than the Americans had active in the Pacific theater. The hunter had become the hunted, and Japan had lost decisively. Lieutenant Commander Yamashita compiled a comprehensive report in July 1944 that documented the full scope of the disaster. Her findings were brutal in their clarity. Since November 1943, the Imperial Navy had lost 134 warships to submarine attack. This represented 28% of Japan's total warship strength at the start of that period. At current loss rates, the Navy would lose its ability to conduct fleet operations by mid-1945. More devastating than the raw numbers was the loss of experienced personnel. Japan had begun the war with superbly trained sailors and officers, products of years of rigorous preparation. By 1944, those veterans were dead. The cruiser crews that went down with Maya and Oi, the destroyer sailors who drowned with Tanikaze and Matsukaze, these men couldn't be replaced. New recruits received weeks of training, not years. The institutional knowledge that made a navy effective was being systematically erased with every ship that slipped beneath the waves. The industrial impact compounded the human tragedy. Japan's shipyards, already struggling with material shortages and Allied bombing, couldn't replace losses at even a fraction of the rate ships were being sunk. In 1944, Japanese yards completed 31 new destroyers and escorts. American submarines sank 97 Japanese destroyers and escorts that same year. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan's navy was being eliminated faster than it could be rebuilt. American submarine commanders had developed hunting patterns that exploited every Japanese weakness. Commander Roy Davenport of USS Hake perfected the down-the-throat shot, firing torpedoes directly at approaching escorts, forcing them to evade and exposing the ships they were protecting. Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Parche developed night surface attacks, using radar to track convoys in total darkness and firing from positions Japanese lookouts couldn't detect. The final 6 months of 1944 saw losses reach their horrifying peak. In October alone, 23 Japanese warships were sunk by submarines, including the heavy cruiser Atago, flagship of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, torpedoed by USS Darter during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The loss of Atago, with Admiral Kurita forced to swim for his life, symbolized the complete collapse of Japanese naval power. By December 1944, Lieutenant Commander Yamashita's casualty count had reached 267 warships destroyed by submarines since November 1943. The projection she had made nearly a year earlier, 370 warships lost by the end of 1945, was tracking with terrifying accuracy. Admiral Koga, who had dismissed her analysis as impossible, had died in a plane crash in March. His successor, Admiral Toyoda Suemu, read her updated report and simply signed it without comment. There was nothing left to say. The final toll, counted after Japan's surrender in August 1945, confirmed what Yamashita had predicted. American submarines had sunk 334 Japanese warships during the war, with the vast majority destroyed between late 1943 and mid-1945. This represented 56% of all Japanese major warship losses during the entire Pacific War. Submarines had proven more deadly than carrier aircraft, surface engagements, and strategic bombing. The efficiency was unprecedented in naval warfare. The U.S. submarine force, never exceeding 150 boats on patrol at any one time, had destroyed over half of Japan's navy. Individual submarines averaged 2.8 warships sunk per boat. USS Flasher alone sunk 21 Japanese vessels. USS Tautog claimed 26. These numbers exceeded the combined achievements of entire surface fleets in previous wars. The human cost behind the statistics was immeasurable. Over 47,000 Japanese sailors died aboard warships sunk by submarines. Many went down with their ships, trapped below decks when torpedoes struck. Others drowned in oil-slicked waters, watching rescuers afraid to stop for fear of becoming targets themselves. Some survived the sinking only to spend days in the ocean before dying of exposure, thirst, or shark attacks.
Lieutenant Commander Akiko Yamashita survived the war. In her final report, dated August 20, 1945, she wrote a postscript that would be discovered decades later in Japanese naval archives. "We built a navy to fight battles. The Americans built a navy to win a war. We expected combat between surface fleets, the decisive engagement that would determine supremacy. They sent submarines to strangle our logistics, hunt our warships, and destroy our ability to fight. We were preparing for Tsushima. They gave us something we had no defense against. The silent hunters beneath the waves defeated us before our battleships ever had a chance to prove their worth." The legacy of the submarine campaign extended far beyond World War II. Every modern navy studied the statistics and learned the lessons. Surface fleets without effective anti-submarine warfare were vulnerable to systematic destruction.
Intelligence, when properly exploited, was as deadly as any weapon. Technology gaps could determine outcomes regardless of courage or training. Yet despite its decisive impact, the submarine campaign remained largely unknown outside naval circles. There were no famous battles, no dramatic footage, no celebrated admirals leading fleets to glory. Just submarines slipping beneath dark waters, firing torpedoes that ended lives and sank ships, then disappearing before anyone knew they had been there. In the end, Japan's navy was defeated not by the dramatic carrier clashes at Midway or the Philippine Sea, but by the patient, methodical work of submarine crews who hunted day after day in empty oceans, waiting for targets that ultra-intelligence promised would come. When those targets appeared, the submarines struck with devastating effectiveness, then vanished back into the depths. 334 warships destroyed, 47,000 sailors killed, a navy eliminated, and most of the world never knew it happened. The silent hunters had written their victory in the dark waters of the Pacific, in a story told only by the ships that never came home.